All right, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Overtime Best Practices, Helping Small Businesses Improve Efficiency and Reduce Costs. I'm Colin Mention, Marketing Specialist at Kronos SaaS HR. I'm joined today by Chris Marie Suby, President and CEO of the Labor Management Institute and a member of the Workforce Education Organization, or WEO. I'm really excited about working with Chris Marie and the WEO in partnership going forward, because in addition to providing future content like this, the WEO offers a fantastic certification program. And this program will give you all more insight into the labor issues facing businesses today, empowering you to further understand how the solutions you provide can truly bring value to the businesses you work with. Now, we have a great lineup of content for you all today, so we likely won't be able to answer any questions during the session. If you do, however, have a question, just pop it in the box, and we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar. So with that said, Chris Marie, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Colin. I appreciate it. It's my pleasure to be with everybody today, and as we are going forward in the slides here, please do feel free to connect with Colin and send him your emails afterwards for today's program presentation. And okay, my background is in workforce management. I've worked with a number of industries, aviation, manufacturing, retail, resorts, casinos, and healthcare. I publish a newsletter on workforce management, the perspectives in staffing and scheduling, and I publish a national survey of hours report, a benchmark for healthcare, and participate on the editorial board of several journals. In today's program, we're going to be covering 4 objectives. We're going to be looking at the requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act, different types of overtime, changes in the overtime rules that are proposed by the Department of Labor, ways in which overtime will change or impact businesses, and best practices for overtime reduction and management. Now, a few facts about the small business world. The Small Business Administration defines a small business as an enterprise having fewer than 500 employees. 28 million small businesses exist in the United States, with over 50% of the working population working in a small business. Small businesses have generated over 65% of the net new jobs since 1995. 52% of small businesses are home-based. I'm particularly sensitive to small businesses because my company is a small business. So as we look at overtime, there are some requirements within the Fair Labor Standards Act. And this act was originally passed in 1937. The act itself is very short. It's only 2 or 3 pages to read. Congress tinkered with it in 1996 to identify computer employees as exempt employees. In 2004, the law had its most significant change when it looked at the definition of managers and supervisors. Employees are generally aware of its protections. They'll oftentimes tell a manager, you can't do that because you're violating fair labor. So it's very important for managers, department leaders, business executives, human resource to know what's in the Fair Labor Standard Act and to be able to comply with its provisions. And the Department of Labor has been established, and the provisions for governing the law is very well established through the federal and court system. As we think about Fair Labor Standard Act, when you read the actual act itself, it does not require vacation, holiday, severance, or sick pay. It does not require meal or rest periods or holidays or vacation or PTO. The act in and of itself does not require premium pay for weekends or holiday work or pay raises or health and welfare or retirement benefits or payment of final wages to terminated employees. The Fair Labor Standard Act in and of itself does not require those things. What it does require is record keeping, minimum wage protections, overtime rules, and child labor standard protections. All of those other things that have to do with benefit pay and premium pay and differentials and protections are all coming from your organizations that you work for or from your state requirements. So important to know the difference between what's in the federal Fair Labor Standard Act versus what's in your organization's requirements. Now, when we think about overtime, what we have found is that there's two kinds of overtime. And one of the things that we did was to look at overtime, because what was driving me to look at it from a research standpoint was what was it that was causing overtime to go up. So when I worked as an employee with an organization and my boss came and said, your overtime is through the roof, it's out of control, and in fact what they said was your overtime is $6 million this year, I went home scared to death thinking I was going to have to pay it back. And so I really needed to understand how I can control overtime. Now, overtime is paid to non-exempt or hourly employees in all job categories for hours worked in excess of 40 hours in a work week. That's the federal law. There are some states, some unions, some organizations that have set their rules to pay overtime based on hours worked in excess of 30 hours a week, 35 hours a week, 37.5 hours a week. So it's important to know the difference. As an organization or a state, you could never set your overtime limit greater than the federal standard. So as a business, I can't say, well, Fair Labor says 40 hours, so I'm going to pay 44 hours and require that as the minimum before you get overtime. It has to be no more than 40 worked hours in the week. So we can look at overtime in a couple of ways. One is as a percentage of the total worked hours, and one is as a percentage of the total paid hours. When we want to understand the toll that overtime takes on our employees and on our business, we really want to look at that as a percentage of total worked hours. That's where you're going to be able to measure the impact against fatigue and performance and in adverse outcomes to both your customers, your clients, your employees. Now, to make that calculation, it's very simple to do. You add up all your overtime hours and divide it by your total worked hours times 100, and that gives you a percent. If you're going to measure it against total paid hours, then you take all your overtime, divide it against your total paid hours, times 100, and you get a percent. If my overtime is running 6% of total worked hours, then very often what we find is when I put it against all of the paid non-productive time, that same overtime will look like it's only 4 or 5%, which isn't nearly as concerning as what it is when it gets to be in excess of 5%. Now, in the research that we've done, we looked at overtime, and there were two things that became very clear. There was overtime that we called end of shift or incidental overtime. I've been doing this work for about 35 years, and so we really created end of shift overtime before incidental existed. Those are events that are less than 30 minutes per occurrence, and that's generally where we find the greatest association to adverse outcomes, whether it's on-the-job injuries, worker comp issues, whether it's customer falls, or in healthcare it might be patient falls or med errors. Whatever the industry is, there are more adverse events associated to overtime that's less than 30 minutes per event. Regular overtime is any overtime that's greater than 30 minutes, and generally that's related to the work of the unit. So when you're looking at your overtime, always pay attention to your short incidental end of shift overtime, because that's something that you can really control and make a difference in, but it has the greatest adverse event impact to your departments. When we look at the end of shift overtime, the things that usually cause it to occur, the biggest one is that it's a side effect to tardy late occurrences. So somebody's late to work, somebody has to stay late to cover them. We often find that if shifts are mismatched, so one group of employees comes to work at 6:45 in the morning, the other group in the same department comes to work at 7. Consequently, somebody is staying late to wait on somebody who's coming at a different shift start time. Sometimes, particularly in some of the time and attendance systems that are not up to date, the time clocks may have their own setting for the time in them, and so we can find a bank of clocks where they're all together in a row, but one clock is early, one clock is on time, and one clock is late. And so you have 3 employees that punch in together, and they will have different times on their clocks. In the newer system, the time clocks are controlled as a computer function so that all the clocks are the same. But some of the older clocks, that's one of the side effects that you'll see. In some cases, we find patterns of tardy-late occurrences. So in the first week of the pay period, people are tardy and late. The second week, they're staying late for that incidental overtime. So they go home with the same dollars in their check, but not the same hours worked. And so we call that a 2-4 overtime pattern. And then one of the biggest things that contributes to the end of shift overtime is a lack of enforcement in your discipline policies. So almost every organization has policies that allow managers to discipline employees when they're tardy and late for work, but they're not often used. And that's one of the things that if you can implement those policies and follow them, generally it takes 2 to 3 times of enforcing the policy and employees will comply with it. So you really want to make sure that you're on top of that. What I'm sharing with you is an overtime report that I create when I'm working with clients looking at their workforce management. And I just want to pull out and show you a couple things. First off, you'll notice that we've broken this out into regular overtime and end of shift overtime. And you'll notice that they're running very high overtime. Some of the units are up at 18, 19, 20% in their overtime. Their end of shift overtime is running another 0.5 to 1% of their time. So together, that's raising their overtime up to the 20% mark, which is very costly, very expensive, and it exhausts the staff. So it leads to the highest disengagement and the highest turnover in your employees. Now, in many organizations, they use on-call in order to identify staff that will come back to work when the volume of work goes up. The callback may be paid at an overtime rate, or it might be paid at a different rate that could be higher than overtime. So when we look at the percent of overtime, we want to be sure that we're not being critical if the overtime is reflecting holiday pay, which may be paid at time and a half when employees work on the holiday, or that it's not reflecting callback pay if we do have a department where we have a lot of callback time. So really want to pay attention to what is the worked overtime in the department, what is the end of shift overtime. Now, one of the things that you'll see here from the end of shift overtime is that we look at it by shift. So they had 246 occurrences of regular overtime that was longer than 30 minutes per event. Of the end of shift overtime, they had 174 events in 2 weeks, of which the greatest number of events were occurring in the 3 to 11 shift. So one of the things to look at is what's going on in that 3 to 11 shift that's driving all of the end of shift overtime. And is it legitimate? Is it reasonable? Is it people that are lingering at the shift change and they're just not getting signed out within that 6 or 7 minutes of time? What's driving that? Now, other things that can drive overtime have to do with the way that we do employee schedules. So one of the things that we will do as part of our assessment is to audit a schedule. And we work with organizations through the years to develop a list of best practice criteria. So when employees are leaving organizations because of scheduling and staffing practices that are going on, when we interview them, we often find that the things that are driving them away from the unit are things that are violating these best practices. So one of the things that we do is we look at what shifts they're working. And in this particular case, they had defined 5 different shifts that were 8 and 12 hours in length that employees were to work. Well, it happened that we found 2 shifts. One was a 12-hour shift starting at 8 a.m. and another one was an 8-hour shift starting at 8 a.m. that were both shifts of convenience to the employees for their daycare needs, but they weren't shifts of need to the department for where the work was. So you want to be sure that when you're scheduling employees that you know the difference between shifts of need and shifts of convenience. We looked at, this was 900 employees that we looked at. They had about 24% full-time employees, 66% part-time employees. And when we looked at their worked hours, one of the things that we found was that across a 4-week schedule, they had 661 occurrences from these 900 employees where people were working more hours than what they were hired in 1 week and fewer hours in the second week. So, for example, if I'm hired to work 12-hour shifts and I'm going to work 3 shifts a week, in some circumstances, the employees were signing up for shifts so they would work 1 shift in 1 week and 5 shifts in the next week. So in the pay period, they had 72 hours, but in the week in which they did 5 12-hour shifts, they had 20 hours of overtime. So those are the kinds of things that you really want to watch because that becomes all pre-scheduled overtime. And in their case, they had almost 300 shifts of pre-scheduled overtime. We look at how many employees did not work the hours that they were hired, because if I've hired somebody and I can't hire anybody else, but they're not working what I've hired them to, then that means I either have to work short or I have to work overtime in order to fill those missing shifts. So whenever employees are taking vacation time, you want to make sure that whether it's planned or an emergency unplanned, that that time is always associated to their accrued PTO hours or the vacation hours bank. Otherwise, you're going to be penalized because their accrued hours keep increasing, which increases your liability to replace those hours, while your reimbursement in the budget will go down because when finance looks at how many hours you used last year, you didn't use very many hours. So you're covering absences that are not being reflected in your non-productive time. Okay, so it ends up as a manager penalizing you. Now that process again is what we call 2-4 overtime pattern. So take a look in your schedules and see if people are working consistently the same hours in each week. We look at the worked hours in a 24-hour period or the worked hours in a single work week. And what we often find is employees that are working more than 60 hours in a week and employees who are working more than 15 hours in a 24-hour period. And both of those will increase the overtime and affect fatigue and performance. And consequently, if you're working more than 15 hours in a shift in a day, it's most likely you're going to have less than 8 hours off between shifts, which will also drive up your overtime. Now, we looked at single-day shifts, and one of the reasons we do that is that we find between 20 and 30% of single shifts will end up as a call-in, and most call-in shifts are replaced at overtime. So when you have a lot of part-time employees, such as this organization did, then people will work a day, they'll be off a couple of days, they'll work a day, they'll be off a day, and it's very easy for those employees to call in sick on those single days because they figure you're not going to miss them anyhow because they weren't here yesterday, and so they don't know how busy it is today. If you schedule employees to always try to have them do 2 consecutive shifts, it'll increase the continuity of their work so that they understand how important it is that they show up for their shifts and that they not call in. And just pairing up those shifts, and you can't do that for every single person on every single shift, but as often as you can pair them up to do at least 2 consecutive shifts, you can reduce your overtime between 1 and 2% just from that alone. When we look at how people are working their patterns of shifts, if you're allowing people to mix shifts and they're doing 8 and 12-hour shifts, you can do 2 8-hour shifts and do 2 12-hour shifts, which will be 40 hours in a week, which is neutral for overtime. You could do 3 12-hour shifts and 1 8-hour shift, so 3 12-hour shifts in each week is a total of 6 12-hour shifts, plus 1 8-hour shift will give you 80 hours in 2 weeks, but it will give you 4 hours of pre-scheduled overtime. Or you could do 2 12 hours and 7 8-hour shifts, which will give you 80 hours in 2 weeks, but that will give you 8 hours of pre-scheduled overtime. So as leaders in your departments, as managers, as people responsible for producing schedules, you always want to make sure that you are the one that's determining what kind of shift combos you're doing, and that's not something that changes from schedule to schedule at the whim of the employee. And then you want to look at consecutive stretches. Now it happens that these were all 12-hour shifts, And in this particular case, they had many employees that were working from 6 to 10 consecutive days without a day off. So, of course, if you're working 7 days in a row, 10-hour or 12-hour shifts, you're going to incur overtime. So, and then take a look at your sick calls before and after a day off, because very likely you'll see an increase in those, particularly if you have a lot of part-time people who are calling in sick on those single shifts. One of the things we always recommend is to take a look at the kinds of requests in your schedule. If you have mostly unplanned activity, call-ins for sick time, LOA, FMLOA, bereavement time, jury duty, those things that you can't plan on from a month ago when you did the schedule until now are all unexpected absences. And when we find that the unexpected absences are greater than the planned absences, then what you're really dealing with is very selfish practices in the unit. Not the employees are being selfish, but the practices are being selfish. So the more that there are planned absences, then the lower the overtime is. Okay? Now, there's some new rules that are being proposed by the Department of Labor for overtime. And for exempt employees, there have been some white-collar exemptions that were created for executive employees, administrative employees, learned professionals, creative professionals, computer staff, and outside sales. And there's been 3 tests for exemption to determine if an exemption is warranted or if the employee is being misclassified. And that's a salary level, a salary basis, and then the duties that go along with it. Now, in 1938, when the Fair Labor Standard Act was established, they determined that an exempt employee was someone who was paid $30 per week. Okay? That has since changed, and through the years, they have changed those minimum requirements so that in 2004, they required that to be exempt, you had to have a minimum of $455 per week in pay, or for highly compensated individuals, $100,000 a year in minimum salary. In 2015, going into effect before the end of this year, what the Department of Labor is looking at is increasing that number from $455 a week to $921 a week, which would increase the minimum annual salary to almost $48,000. And that would affect the executive, the administrative, and the professional employees. In 2016, so effective January 1st or sometime in the first quarter, they want to increase that further to the 40th percentile, which would raise it then from $455 a week now to $970 a week, which would mean a minimum annual income of $50,400. So it's going to affect every business, and Human Resources is beginning the process of looking at the job classifications in order to be able to determine who's going to be affected by this. The component for the highly compensated test is based on the 90th percentile, and they'll be raising that rate from $100,000 up to $122,148 annually. Now, within the salary level test, again, that comes back to changing that minimum requirement of $455 per week, or about $24,000 a year, to be an exempt employee, and less than that, you can be non-exempt or hourly and eligible for overtime. One of the other provisions that they're looking at is the option of having the salary levels change automatically on a yearly basis based on either a fixed percentile of the earnings for the full-time salaried employees or based on the consumer price index. Now, one of the concerns is, when will businesses be notified of what that level is going to be? As a small business, how do you plan on that if you don't know about it until it hits you? And then if it's going to be based on earnings, how do you report your earnings until after the end of the year and then go back retrospectively to make those changes in salary? So there's a lot of implications to it that we don't know the answers for. In some of the duty tests that are going to be affecting administrative employees is in the work that they perform, is it directly related to the management or general business operations of the company? And as a primary duty, does it include the exercise and discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance? So if you have administrative employees that are helping with timekeeping or human resource functions or management functions, then they're going to have to meet both the salary requirement and the duties requirement in order to continue in that process. When they look at executive employee exemptions, then it's going to require that they have to manage a full department or a subdivision, a service line, that they have to customarily and regularly direct the work of 2 or more employees, and they have to have the authority to hire or fire or to recommend employee hiring, firing, advancement, and promotions. So if they don't meet those duties tests, then they will not be allowed to continue as exempt employees. So will that have an effect, for example, on some of the people that you're allowing to do job evaluations or timekeeping or those kinds of things? Will that impact that? Looking at professional employees are those folks that generally require committed long-term educational programs, your physicians, your lawyers, folks like that, in some cases what we often find is for, in the healthcare arena, is for the therapists. PT, OT, and speech therapy are very often considered exempt by the professional status versus any other criteria. So there's some unique requirements there. And then outside salary employees, especially for small businesses, are they working away from the employer's place of business, and is their primary duty in making sales? So it's not intended to affect outside sales and certain professional employees. And then for highly compensated, do they regularly spend time on more exempt duties, and they cannot have any manual work? So they can't go out to the line and relieve employees if there's no one else to work. So it has to be very clear what exactly they're doing. So one of the things that you can do is to go out to the Department of Labor website at www.dol.gov. You can look for the Federal Register for the overtime changes, and you can submit your comments, but only until September 4th, and after September 4th it will be closed, and they'll be making their recommended changes after that. Now, they're looking for comments about what, if any, changes should be made to the duties test. Should the Department of Labor reinstate the long and short duty list in order to distinguish between exempt and non-exempt employees? And should employees be required to spend a minimum amount of time performing non-exempt work? So, for example, in California, they require that every exempt employee has to spend at least 50% of all their time not working directly with clients or customers or patients, whatever the industry is, so that they have to have essentially, to be safe, 51% of their time in management and no more than 49% of their time in direct work. So how are we going to track that? How is it going to be reported? And when will that affect the exempt status for the employee? For computer professionals, they're looking at specifically continuing to include all computer professionals with the exception of help desk, and it's going to be unlikely to keep the help desk personnel out of the exempt status, and they'll be moving into the non-exempt status eligible for overtime. Then they're looking at whether or not occupations should be considered exempt or non-exempt, and also looking at bonuses and commissions and salary level. So if you've been within a salary program that's provided periodic bonuses or commissions, they're going to limit that to not to exceed 10% of the annual salary. So again, there's going to be some changes there. One of the things that's been raised, but it's not part of this consideration at this time, is the use of electronic devices by white-collar workers. So will it now become a requirement to pay people for using, for responding to text messages, emails, calls after a certain time of the day, or after 8 hours of work, or after 40 hours of work within the week? So how are we going to track that, and so on? The Department of Labor is going to put out a unique and standalone request for information. It'll be released sometime in August, and then they will close that after 60 days and take the comments and make a decision from there. Now, when we think about overtime best practices, how is this going to impact businesses, or what can businesses do about it? So one of the things is to not wait for the rule to go through. Take a look at your current employee situation, work with your human resource department to see if you need to reassess employee classifications for exempt and non-exempt. And then if you're going to have classifications that are going to change, what will that mean to you as managers, directors, presidents, vice presidents over your employee areas? You want to take a look at the duties test requirement and make sure that you're changing your management structure to reflect that, particularly around updating job descriptions, job posting and recruiting materials, updating performance reviews to reflect exempt duties. So if an employee qualifies as an exempt employee, not only will the job description have to reflect that, but the performance review will have to reflect that. And legal experts are recommending that exempt employees certify their performance for their exempt duties. So it will become something that will be auditable by the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division. Supervisors will have to address the exempt duty or the non-exempt duties within those job descriptions, particularly when it's a combined role. And in your onboarding for your new hires, you're going to need to address that within the orientation materials as well. So in every business, large or small, there's going to be an impact to this once the Department of Labor decides what's going to be approved. When we consider the annual budget, it's going to be important to understand what the increase in dollars is going to mean, because your FTEs, the number of people that you've hired, won't change, but the dollars that you're paying will, so the cost of business will go up. And for those that move from exempt to non-exempt status and are now earning overtime, most likely you will see an increase in overtime. Okay? So very important that if you haven't been watching your overtime, to pay attention to your overtime. Now, when we talk about best practices, one of the things that we have done is to look at what would we consider normal overtime. And in best practice, we always want the overtime to be as low as it possibly can. And the reason we want it to be low, one, because it's more cost effective to the organization. Two, it's better for the employees' performance and their health. And what we found is that when we look at different industries, normal overtime is less than 4.9% of total worked hours. When you have overtime that's between 5 and 7.9%, think of it as a sign of financial bleeding. It's really, we often find that it's due to imbalances in the schedule. For example, there's too many people on the day shift, not enough on the evening and night shift, so we cancel on one shift and we pull people in on overtime on the other shift. Sometimes it feels like the right thing to do, especially in June, July, and August, to approve extra vacation time. But if you don't have the resources to cover that extra vacation time, then you're either choosing to work short or you're having to fund it out of your overtime, and that's not what it was intended for. Very often, if you go back to the schedule and you look at the schedule imbalances, you can reduce your overtime between 1 and 3% without doing anything to the status of the employees, without laying employees off, without changing their full-time, part-time commitment, just from fixing the imbalances in the schedule. If your overtime exceeds 8%, think of that as financial hemorrhaging. And generally, the underlying drivers for that is your vacancies or your LOA and your FMLOA. If those are very high and you don't have any other staff to replace, you don't have the ability to pull in temporary contract employees, sometimes they're called per diem casuals, then you will end up with very high overtime. The other thing that will affect that is what we call other workload. So you may be producing work on the line at so many hours per unit of service, but if you have a lot of vacancy, then you may have a lot of your employees working overtime to make up the difference. So you'll see both an increase in your dollars per unit of service, as well as your hours per unit of service because of the extra work they're doing. And then you want to come back and look at the other things that have to do with schedule and balance. Now, one of the things to do is to monitor the missed punches because that really takes a toll in scheduling. If you've ever gone through a Department of Labor audit, what they're looking for is to pay employees from punch in to punch out. So when employees are not punching in or they're not punching out, then it's requiring you as a leader or a floor manager or a director or a boss to go in and manufacture those punches for the employees. So you really want to be careful of that. The goal should be that the employee is making 99% of their punches and that you're not having to manufacture a punch for them in more than 1% of the occurrences. So how do you figure out what that is? So a full-time employee who's doing 8-hour shifts is going to work 5 shifts a week, 10 shifts in a pay period. So if I have 10 shifts and I have a punch in and a punch out, that's 10 shifts times 2 punches is 20 punches in a pay period. 20 punches in a pay period times 26 pay periods is going to be 520 punches a year. If they're not punching in and missing more than 1% of their punch-ins or punch-outs, that's putting more work on you as managers, and it's also a greater likelihood that they're ending up with incidental overtime. So that's one way in order to curb that and reduce your tardy late occurrences. Hold the same standard for your tardy late occurrences as well. And then to help yourself in the management of it and the reduction of it is to run monthly reports by your department, by your division, by your service line, however you have your business organized, to look at the payroll performance criteria, the percent of missed punches, the percent of tardy early out events, the percent of overtime, both to total worked and total paid hours, and then other points that we pointed out on the schedule audit. Now, when we think of best practices, there's 10 of them. So first off, you want to define the budget for the department and address the overtime in hours and as a percent of total worked hours. I would not recommend hiring into the overtime, but rather to have an awareness. If I had 1,000 hours last year and I'm coming up on 5,000 hours in the first quarter of this year, what's going on that's driving my overtime? And I want to get to the bottom of it as quickly as I can. Best practice number 2 is to identify a pattern for use of resources developed from the workload. Employees will be hired to meet the needs of the department. We're here to get the work done versus an obligation to produce paychecks that are all around when employees want to work versus when they're needed to work. So be sure that you're looking at what is the workload of the department, when do I need the resources. If I have most of my work coming in between 2 in the afternoon and 10 at night, it doesn't make sense to have most of my resources available at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. So get the resources onto the shift where the work occurs. In best practice number 3, you want to define within your budget who's doing the work, which employees are directly working with the customers or the clients or the patients, and who's working indirectly. So that's typically your managers, your clerical support. When we have enough people working directly with our customers, our clients, our patients, then that direct care will result in greater patient satisfaction, greater customer satisfaction, greater client satisfaction. When we don't have enough direct workers, then oftentimes managers are having to step out of their role in order to cover at the service line in order to produce that work. And under the new Department of Labor changes, if an exempt manager is being pulled out of that role, 50% of the time or more, they may lose their exempt classification. So again, very important that we understand the difference for that. And if your education and orientation is mapped to your non-productive time, then you want to be sure that whenever you have training or education of any kind, that employees are always punching correctly to that code so that you're getting credit for it. If they don't, then it will automatically track into your productive worked hours, and your hours per unit of service will go up. So want to make sure that you're tracking that correctly. In best practice number 4, you want to clearly identify the pay incentives, the premium pay, the bonuses, the on-call, and the callback. If you have on-call and callback practices that do not match the policy of the company, you're at risk for unfair pay practices, and so you want to make sure that that's always consistent with your policy. You want to make sure that any bonuses you're paying are defined in your human resource policies. I recently worked with an organization where we found 13 different kinds of bonuses, and only one of which was defined with a human resource policy. They were spending about $63,000 a month in bonus pay, and when we discontinued that, they dropped down to about $3,300 a month in bonus pay. So it can become very destructive and very costly to the organization. In best practice number 5, you want to monitor the overtime for both the regular overtime and the end of shift or incidental overtime, and trend it for both its use and abuse patterns. In best practice number 6, you want to publish schedules with at least 85% of all the shifts that are being scheduled coming from your core staff. If you're relying on your schedules to be worked based on people floating into your cost center, or outside agency or travelers, or temporary contract employees, per diem casuals, whatever your industry calls them, then it's like having more strangers on the unit. And the higher the number of strangers on the unit, the more adverse it becomes for the customers, the clients, the patients, and the more overtime you'll have, the more on-the-job injuries. And generally this is because the core staff is spending a lot of their time helping the strangers on the unit. So it becomes a great dissatisfier to your core staff. So you'll always want to make sure that at least 85% of all the shifts you're working are coming from your core. In best practice number 7, you want to require managers to publish schedules with less than 5% of the shifts where you didn't meet your target number of people working. So if I say I need to have 10 people scheduled today, and I'm publishing a schedule where I only have 7, that's 3 holes in my schedule. So how many shifts does it take to publish a schedule? Of that total number of shifts, what's 5% of those shifts? And unless you have excessive overtime or excessive vacancies or leave of absences, every manager should be able to hit that 5% target. If you have scheduling committees or people that you've designated the scheduling activities to, then you need to hold them accountable for the same performance criteria. The greater the number of holes in the schedule, the greater number of call-ins you'll have, the greater amount of overtime you'll have. In best practice number 8, it's to monitor your on-call and callback hours for both use and abuse patterns. Worked with an organization where the CFO called and he said, we're spending $1 million a year in on-call pay. And he asked me if that was a lot, and I said, yes, it was. So we looked at it, and 46% of all the employees in the organization were getting on-call pay. Now, that they were only being paid $2.83 an hour for on-call pay, but some employees were getting $17,000 a year in on-call pay because they were on-call 24/7, including the weeks that they were on vacation and out of the country. So it was excessive. And the problem is that on-call pay is blended with your base hourly rate. So if I have an hourly rate of $20 an hour and a $2.83 an hour on-call rate, it gets blended together. So now my rate is really going to be closer to $25, and then overtime is time and a half my blended rate of pay. So when I have on-call that's unnecessary, it increases my base rate of pay, which will drive up my overtime rates that I'm paying, which comes down in your dollars in your cost per unit of service. So very expensive thing to do. Best practice number 9 is to look at, there's 6 target thresholds that we've identified that contribute to your overtime. If you're publishing schedules where you're giving out more than 10% of your total worked hours as planned vacation or PTO, overtime will go up. If your unplanned absences, the call-ins, the death in family, the jury duty, anything that's unplanned, the intermittent FMLA, is greater than 5% of total worked hours, overtime will go up. If your LOA or FMLOA is greater than 10% of total worked hours, your overtime will go up. If your vacancy is greater than 10% of total worked hours, your overtime will go up. If you do use on-call in your departments, other than in the only industry that would have on-call hours greater than 3% of total worked hours is in the healthcare industry, particularly in the peri-op services. And normal for them would be greater than 10% of total worked hours for on-call. And then callback should be less than 10% of the on-call hours in every other industry, with the exception of healthcare and perioperative. And in their case, because of their on-call teams, it's more likely to be around 40 to 50% of their on-call hours. So there's some very specific thresholds that we've found. Now, knowing those thresholds, then compare those thresholds against customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, the LOA and FMLOA absences, the employee turnover, on-the-job injuries, and worker compensation claims. And very often what you'll find is that the higher the overtime is, over 5%, the higher the likelihood is for adverse outcomes with employees, the greater the dissatisfaction by customers, by employees, and that will lead you to higher disengagement for employees to stay at an organization and higher turnover when they're leaving. So all of those things work together. So when we think of some key takeaways, what we're looking at here is implementing best practices to help your organization monitor and reduce your overtime that will affect your decisions on your human resources and your variable workload, coping with labor shortages, developing employee competencies and reducing skill shortages, and then implementing those strategies so you're delivering your standards of labor very cost effectively.
All right, thank you, Chris Marie. Excellent information and some great takeaways for the audience to bring to their clients and businesses they work with. Now, trying to implement these best practices via a manual process would be quite the daunting task. But as you likely know, a workforce management solution can really help simplify everything and provide some great benefits for the users. So for instance, a robust solution can help businesses automate the execution of both internal policy and regulatory enforcement. By having them automated, there's far less risk of human error potentially resulting in a violation, which can cost an average of anywhere from $78,000 to $150,000 in fees just to get to court. That doesn't even include the cost of a fine if found to be in violation, or a host of other legal fees. That's big bucks for a small business. A solution is also going to be able to track and store labor data. But why is that critical? Well, having that data at their fingertips means businesses are able to pull a variety of key reports. And when they can pull reports on their labor data from different time periods, they're able to more easily analyze and compare that data to help make sure they're on track. So in general, a workforce management solution is great for businesses because it helps ensure compliance. Now, compliance is an absolutely critical topic, but especially for small and mid-sized businesses, aka SMBs. I mean, check out that stat right there. According to the Office of Advocacy of the US SBA, small businesses pay 36% more per employee than larger businesses to comply with government regulations. I mean, that's just a staggering number, especially when you consider that SMBs typically have fewer resources to begin with. So clearly, these businesses are in dire need of a solution to help reduce their risk of compliance issues. I highly encourage you to check out this ebook we recently sponsored titled Big Regulations, Small Business, The Case for Workforce Management, as it covers the top compliance challenges SMBs today are facing beyond just the FLSA, and includes topics like the Affordable Care Act, Family Medical Leave Act, or FMLA, and a few others. It builds a strong case for why businesses need to be using automated solutions in order to help ensure compliance. And you can download this ebook, the link we have below there, bit.ly/SMB-compliance. But really, compliance overall is just one piece of the human capital management puzzle. So right now, Kronos SaaS HR has the only human capital solution that offers the power of one cloud-based platform complete with HR, payroll, and time and labor management, all on a single database. And this is necessary in today's world because you can't have any true end-to-end solution for human capital management without information from all three of these functional areas. Our platform can essentially act as one application that has one employee record. As our partners like to say, there's just one field for last name across the platform for each employee. Now, the best part about this truly end-to-end platform is that it allows your clients to recruit, retain, manage, and grow their workforce from the day they decide to hire a new employee to the day that employee retires. And it helps you significantly grow your business and better service your clients.
I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the Workforce Educational Organization. It's a nonprofit professional organization for timekeepers. The American Payroll Association has a professional association to represent payroll personnel, but the Workforce Educational Organization was created to provide a professional association for everyone who is serving as timekeepers. So to learn more about the organization, go out to www.weo-cert.org. Today's program will count as one continuing education unit of credit towards recertification for all of those WEO members who are WEO Timekeeper Certified or WEO Timekeeper Professional Certified. So we thank the Workforce Educational Organization for their willingness to provide this continuing education credit for them.
All right.
I want to thank.
Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I want to thank Josh Davis and Colin Mention for putting together the program today and everything that it took to launch this program, and particularly Kronos SaaS HR for sponsoring the program.
Yeah, and I just want to take a second to thank you, Chris Marie. I thought this was really beneficial, and there were really a lot of good takeaways in there for everyone. And a special thank you to all our attendees. If you entered a question, again, we'll be sure to follow up with you, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.